Right, I suppose what we've heard is talk about wholes and cultures and big things that pass. And perhaps I want to talk about fragments and dislocations. Because despite my lovely English tones, yes, I'm very English, and also slightly not, because I was a refugee as a child. When we came during the Cold War from Hungary as refugees from the 56 revolution, and I was smuggled out after my mother, who paid all her jewels. Once she'd finally arrived in Austria, she decided maybe she wanted me after all. So she paid her jewels to a smuggler who extraordinarily came back to our village, and my grandmother handed me over, and I got on a train with this man, and my grandmother didn't get on. And I watched my grandmother through this window, and then I didn't see her for a very long time. And I just spent time with this man and other people, and we travelled and things happened. And then one day I went into a room full of people sitting down, and one of the people got up with a great cry, and that was my mother. I had been very fortunate because she had made an arrangement with the smuggler. There was going to be a time and a place, but we were about 10 days late. But she stayed, and I was reunited with her. And because it was the Cold War, and because it was communism, it wasn't the age of the internet and being able to keep in touch, when you left, it was like the closing of a door. And for my parents, they made it very clear that a door had closed, and what had gone on in the past could never be righted, so all we had to do was move forward. So for me as the child, I grew up in Britain, I went to school in Britain, I became English. At home it was very different, and I had this strange relationship with my own former language, because my parents encouraged me to speak English because that's what I would learn to read and write, and they spoke to me in Hungarian, and it was only later that I taught myself to read and write Hungarian, which was very fortunate, and then I became a British citizen, which was a very important thing, because as a refugee you have a travel document. You can travel anywhere in the world with it technically, but you cannot return to your country of origin with that travel document. Out of my mother and me and my stepdad, another Hungarian refugee, I was the only one who became British because my parents were a little bit damaged. They didn't really interact very well with authority. I remember in my first few years in England, if we saw any policemen, this is 1950s British Bobby coming towards us, we immediately stopped talking and smartly moved to the other side of the road. That's what I learnt from my parents. I kind of got over that. But I became British, and after I'd finished university, I had gone home for a visit, and my mother was in a slight tiz-was because she said, "I've just heard your father's died. I want you to go back and check it, because I don't know about him. I mean, he could be sending me this story. I really don't know." I mean, they had divorced years ago, so I had never seen my father, because I had a stepdad. And so I was sent back to Hungary to verify this story. So from 1957 until 1975, I had become English. And then suddenly I was being sent back to this place which had terrible connotations for me, because it was that country of communism, it was the country which had done terrible things to my family, where we had lost everything, my mum had been in prison, etc., etc. And she was sending me back there. So I was going back absolutely terrified to find out if my father was dead or alive. And when you arrive, of course, in Hegyeshalom at that time, your passport is taken and it's checked. You know, it's actually physically taken off the train and taken by people into a room, and they seem to stay there forever, and you're sitting on the train thinking, what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to me? Is everything going to be all right? And then you get your passport back, and you kind of feel a little bit safer. And then go by steam train, you arrive in this village, there's chickens on the line, you're transported back into a different world, almost into a different time. I'm met by my grandmother, who I hadn't seen for a very long time, and eventually, after having to visit everybody in the village because they all knew I was coming, and being sat down and being asked about life in the West, half the questions which I really couldn't understand. Eventually, from the next village across over the hill, my father's brother came to collect me because he was going to show me my father's grave, which was in the big town. So I travelled up to the big town with him, and now he was a peasant, so this was a big thing for him, just going up to the big town, because he went by train. It wasn't just going over the next hill to the village, so you couldn't go in an ox cart. You had to go by train. And so, of course, he was telling me where to go, when to cross the street, to watch the traffic, because this was the big city. So, of course, you just play along, because otherwise, if you say, well, I know how to do all this stuff, then you're seen as the big, arrogant person coming from the West. And he couldn't remember where my father was buried exactly, so we then went to visit the woman that he had lived with for many years. So that was a little surprise for me. But also very touching, because he had a photo of me. Well, she had a photo of me, which he had kept. And that was very touching, because when I had been a teenager, I had written to him, but he had never replied. So he had a memento, which was touching to me, at least. And anyway, we all then set off to the cemetery and went to the plot. It's just a very simple little wooden cross. He wasn't a rich man. He'd been a cabinet maker. And on the way, I had to buy a wreath. And you have to buy a proper wreath. You can't take a nice little one which looks pretty. You have to buy one that's big, because you're the daughter and you've come from the West. So you have to buy something ostentatious to show that you recognise your father, and you recognise this kind of kinship relationship, even though he's dead. Then, put the wreath on the grave. I was supposed to cry, but I didn't, so I pretended, because I didn't know him. And then we went back and had tea, coffee. And the woman that he had lived with, she was quite poor. She lived in a kind of what looked like a single room. And then there was a kind of a communal kitchen, so she made us coffee. And then his brothers said, well, I was very welcome to give him any money that I wanted to give him, because they wanted to buy him a gravestone. But it was preferable if I gave him foreign currency. Foreign currency, of course, had a lot of worth. So I played along with that. In fact, I never gave him any foreign currency. And then I forgot to take her address, so that I couldn't write to her. So that was a kind of something that was just left lingering. And then 1 month later, back to Hegyeshalom, and this time the really big moment when, again, the passport is taken, and you're waiting there thinking, are they going to let me go? Will they let me go? Because I can't stay here. This isn't where I belong. I belong over there. And they keep you waiting for a really long time, and you're sitting and sweating and panicking, and then back they come on the train and they give you the passport, and then you can go to Austria. Back to normality. Okay, so that's the story.
Thank you very, very much, Vera.
Not at all.
I think as Michael has to go, we might just film Valentina telling you a little bit about Palermo, and then when his got to go, so then we'll just wrap up here. All right? So Valentina.
Is it working already?
Valentina Castagna teaches English literature at the University of Palermo, and she's been absolutely fantastic collaborator on the project in Sicily.
Thank you, Marina. First of all, I'm grateful to Marina. Oh, sorry. No.
Tell me what it's going to be.
Oh my, okay, she doesn't want me to tell it, but maybe I can say that. I'm grateful to Marina, and I want to thank Matthew as well for this wonderful organization. I'm pleased to be here. From the 26th to the 28th of September, we will be in Palermo. Many of you have already been involved in this project, portable stories in transit, portable stories telling the tale in times of conflict. It is an extended version of this workshop where there will not only be storytellers, writers, and academics, but also representatives from NGOs will be there, and there will also be NGOs such as Save the Children and Libraries Without Borders, who have this wonderful project called Ideas Box, with sort of itinerant libraries and offices. They have tablets, e-books readers, and real books and material they sent to refugee camps in Africa and Greece. Sarah Glaser was telling me that they have sent it to, they recently sent Ideas Box to Greece. And we will be working on stories, starting from the idea that culture is a human right, and that it is necessary to make it clear and provide some means to have some forms of entertainment also in such poor living conditions as in refugees camps. And many of you with whom I had the opportunity to have a chat today and yesterday actually think that we have refugees camps in Sicily. When I think of camps, of course, I think of tents, of sort of temporary places. What we have in Sicily actually are more centers. Some houses have been built, although living conditions are as in camps actually, and people are not able to live as soon as if they don't until they get the asylum seeker status, and it takes many years, and they are not allowed to work according to the Italian law, so they actually have nothing to do because they're not allowed to work. They don't have instruments, tools, they don't have libraries. No, there are some associations and companies who sometimes are given authorization to go into these centers, which are fenced. So these people live within fences. So what we were thinking of doing is developing, as Marina said earlier this morning, if I'm not mistaken, or yesterday, developing a sort of story box with some images or objects that might, be used as moments to start telling tales, not only personal narratives. I think what Kate told us yesterday is a living example, and what Cindy does in her projects is trying to have migrants give them the conditions to feel at ease with a group of operators who are interested in their stories, but without nagging at them. So, for instance, Cindy was telling us earlier that she has this project of storytelling which takes place in a hair salon, and Kate says, I don't want to ask people to tell their stories. I give them a poem or a story, and they start telling that. So I think the idea is actually to create some tools of entertainment and storytelling, putting together all these ideas that you'll be giving us and you've already given us, and transmitting them to NGOs that normally focus on primary needs, okay, so that they might spread it around and better living conditions also from this point of view. So we will have huge NGOs, Save the Children, Médecins Sans Frontières, but we will also be having some local operators, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm using the right word, who are in charge of family houses where young migrants are taken in order to have a sort of smaller community where they can live in better conditions and think they are, with living with friends and some sort of new family, because we have many non-accompanied minors arriving to Sicily, and they will be teenagers they will be 15, 16, okay, so they cannot live often unless they are accompanied by some tutor. So life is not easy at all for them. So we are trying to give them tools to think about their lives and tell about their lives, but from a collective perspective, not only personal, but political and collective perspective. Marina would like to develop something which will be used all over camps and centers. I don't know if I can say that, but we're trying to have the ideas box sent to Palermo. It might be a good opportunity. I don't know if you would like to add something to what I said.
No, that's wonderful.
Maybe we could,
I don't know if there
send.
are questions.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much.
You're
It was
welcome.
you explained really well.
No.
Much better than I can.
No, not at all.
So, are there any questions at all? Because I think Michael has to go, really.
What's the long-term objective?
The long term, okay, it's to establish a discussion and really to have forms of entertainment which might be widespread. I mean, entertainment, I don't know, tools of transmission, especially because if you think of these people, they're often illiterate. So I go back to what Ben was saying earlier, that, and maybe last night as well, that we cannot only focus on writing and creative writing, but we need to focus on performance, on gesture, on voice and rhythm. So it's a way of teaching operators how to develop certain attitudes or qualities, talents that might be found. But of course, we need people to be willing to engage in this way of telling about themselves or storytelling.